What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown and this is Heresy Financial. Just a few days ago, Janet Yellen admitted that inflation is going to likely be more severe and longer lasting than they originally expected. And in case you don't remember, it wasn't even 6 months ago that the Federal Reserve was forecasting less than 3% inflation. And now that there's more severe and more persistent inflation than they originally expected, every effort is being made to downplay both the severity and the causes behind the inflation. For instance, blaming broken supply chains, which are a symptom, not a cause. Now, here's what's going to happen. If inflation doesn't stop everywhere, very soon here, mark my words, price controls are coming. And in fact, in part, they are already here. So in this video, we are going to talk about number 1, the types of price controls. Number 2, where these price controls are already showing up. And then number 3, why and how they only make the problems worse. Ready? Let's dive in. Now, I want to be clear about this forecast that price controls are coming. I think that even if inflation only persists in isolated areas, we're going to see price controls in those isolated areas. Mainly because we've seen demonstrations of soft price controls already. It's gotten to the point where basically any area that causes any amount of pain will fall under the umbrella of the government deciding, hey, we are going to try and control that price. So what are the different types of price controls? There's 2 main types, and we're going to start off with the most common, price ceilings. Now, this is a situation when there's an item whose cost is deemed too expensive by the central planners. And usually one metric that they use is there's a large percentage of people that can't afford to get it. A famous example of this in the West is when Nixon issued price controls, put ceilings on prices of all sorts of things in the 70s. Now, it's vital to remember that price ceilings, price caps, are placed below what the natural price would be. Here's what I mean by that. If an iPhone sells at $1,000, it is ineffective and useless to place a price cap on iPhones at $10,000. Nobody's trying to sell an iPhone at $10,000. Nobody's buying an iPhone at $10,000, so there's no use for it. So the only way that a price cap has any sort of an impact is if the natural price is up here, they institute a price cap or a price ceiling below what the natural price would be. Now, there's another type of price controls, and these are price floors. A very common price floor is a minimum wage. This is a price control because it is the government necessitating a floor at which nobody is allowed to pay less for a given item, in this case wages. And just like a price cap is something that's below what the natural price would be, a price floor is something that is above what the natural price would be. For instance, if you have a bunch of people getting paid $5 an hour, a minimum wage of $10 an hour would have an impact. But it would be useless and ineffective to legislate a minimum $1 an hour wage because nobody's getting paid $1 an hour. The natural minimum wage is $5 an hour. So now we know what price controls are. It is setting a cap on prices below the natural rate or a floor on prices above the natural rate. So now let's look at areas where we're already seeing price controls put in place. The biggest place we're seeing price controls show up in the economy right now is in interest rates. As you know, interest rates and bond prices are directly inversely correlated with each other. If bonds are purchased to the extent where it pushes their price up, that at the same time pushes the interest rates down. And we know that real interest rates are deeply negative right now. That's when you take the nominal interest rate, say 2%, and adjust it for the inflation rate, which is, let's say, 5%, you've got a 3% negative real interest rate. We also know that there is somebody out there who has the ability to create money out of thin air, and they are using that capability to buy $120 billion worth of bonds every single month. And the express purpose of this is to push down interest rates. This is an expression of a price floor on bonds. It pushes the price of bonds up above what the natural price would be, which pushes the interest rate low. It's a ceiling on the interest rate on bonds. Without this price control imposed on bonds, you would see the natural price expressed, and the price of bonds would be much lower, the interest rates would be much higher. So that's how we see price controls showing up in interest rates right now. Another area we see price controls showing up right now is in wages. Now, this is more of a soft price control because the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. A report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2020 showed that only 1.5% of all workers were paid at or below the minimum wage, which means that it does have some effect, but very little, because if that minimum wage was gone, at most 1.5% of workers workers would have their wages lowered. But part of this is because you don't need legislated caps or floors in order to influence and have control over prices. Because we've seen massive pressure to raise the floor on wages recently due to helicopter money between unemployment insurance and child tax credits and stimulus payments. These are things that have contributed to companies basically having to compete with the government in order to attract labor. This effectively does create a higher floor underneath wages because, for example, people are less likely to take a job at $8 an hour if they can stay at home for $9 an hour. So we can see that at least in part, price controls are already here. And as inflation gets worse, especially in isolated areas, we have seen a demonstration that the solution that will be employed is price controls. So the question is this a bad thing? What are the results of price controls? Well, anytime you intervene in a market and you cause the market price to deviate from what the natural price would be, you inevitably make the situation worse overall. And I'll show you why. Let's go back to the example of the iPhone that I used earlier. iPhones have gotten a lot more expensive since their inception, and let's say that trend continues and an iPhone now sells for $2,000. All of a sudden that attracts government attention and they deem $2,000 as too expensive to buy an iPhone. After all, let's say communication and access to the internet are human rights. So the government steps in. Solution is that iPhones are not allowed to be sold for more than $1,000. So we have to step back and ask, why did the iPhones go up to $2,000 in the first place? Well, in this example, let's say the reason for it is that the cost of commodities that are used in the production of an iPhone, let's say they doubled. You've got aluminum, you've got copper, you've got steel, you've got glass, you've got silver. Let's say the prices of these things just doubled. So if Apple wants to be able to maintain their margins, the cost of producing the iPhone went up. They're going to have to raise the cost to sell the iPhone. But the government just told you you're not allowed to sell iPhones at $2,000 anymore. The most you can charge is $1,000. So what are the consequences of this? Well, there are a couple things that could happen here. The first thing is that the quality may drop. Maybe they stop making the iPhones as high-end because the materials cost more and they find out, well, we can still sell them at a little bit of a profit if we just reduce the quality of the materials that we're making them with. We go use some old components. Maybe our quality assurance goes down and we don't have to manufacture as high quality of materials anymore, pay for the labor for that. And so they're able to bring their costs down by lowering their quality. And maybe they stop making the high-end iPhones because maybe those take $1,200 to make. So they're not going to lose $200 on every high-end iPhone. So they're just going to stop making the high quality ones and resort to only making the ones that they can still turn a profit on since they're capped at 1,000. So instantly then the only iPhones that are available to buy are the cheaper ones, the lower quality ones. And when you think about this, it makes sense. Who's going to develop better and better products if the profit potential for that is just removed? There's no incentive. The second thing that would probably happen is that supply of that item would drop. Because if you can't make a profit on something, you're not going to produce it anymore. So at the very least, let's say the high-end iPhones would disappear, and potentially others as well. Now, iPhones are just an example here, but things that you commonly see price controls on around the world throughout history are things like food and gas and rent. And with these things, there are discrepancies in the market with the different suppliers, the different producers having different margins. This means that when a price cap is put in place, you immediately eliminate certain players from the market and you cause the production across the economy of that item to drop because some of the producers will inevitably not be able to make as much money or enough money and they'll have to shut down production. Now, as if this wasn't bad enough, the third thing that commonly happens here is that demand actually spikes. And this might be counterintuitive, so let me explain why. Prices are not a determiner of value. Said another way, prices don't set value. Prices are simply information. They display value. They communicate value. So changing the price of something artificially doesn't change the value of it. All it does is change the information that's communicated to the economy about the value. Going back to why the iPhone was more expensive in the first place, it's because the costs of the inputs, the cost of the materials to make it, rose. This hints something about something that is inherent in nature in which scarcity is universal. So what prices do is they communicate vital information about that scarcity relative to everything else. Now, this is true whether you're talking about wages or commodities or food or money or rent. So when the market price is forced to be different than what the natural price would be, it communicates incorrect information about the scarcity or abundance of a given item. When a price cap is put on something and the market price is lower than what the natural price would be, it's communicating to the economy that there's more abundance of that specific item than there really is. That item is actually more scarce than what the economy believes based on the forced price. So when you get one or two or three of these three things, you get lower quality, lower supply, and higher demand, you inevitably develop shortages because the price cannot respond to the demand to communicate the right scarcity. Another way of saying this is basically a lot more people are going to buy a $1,000 iPhone than would buy a $2,000 iPhone. This is why you saw lines for gas in the 70s. Prices were not allowed by law to react to the actual scarcity, and there would not have been shortages if the prices had been allowed to rise. And yes, the rising prices are painful for a short amount of time, but what that does is it increases the profit incentive of any potential producers, because as the price rises, so do the profit margins. And that attracts new producers to come into the market and increase the supply. And then as the supply increases in response to that price going up, you eventually solve the problem and the prices come back down as the new supply hits the market. Similarly, this is why there is currently a shortage of labor for companies. Many companies, especially small businesses, simply cannot find enough labor. Now, it's easy enough for large corporations to raise their minimum wage, but it prices out the small businesses who can't afford to do so. So this has the added consequence of not only causing a labor shortage, but it concentrates the available labor into the hands of the mega corporations that can afford it. So then what's next? What happens after the shortages crop up? Well, instead of recognizing their error, usually what happens is the central planners take it one step further and one step further and one step further. They'll recognize that after the price controls came in, there were shortages. They'll recognize that part of the problem for this is because supply actually dropped because producers dropped off because they couldn't afford to make it and sell it at those reduced prices. They'll also know that demand went up when the price controls were instituted. That was part of the reason for it, so more people would have access to be able to get it. So in light of the increased demand and the decreased supply, they're going to choose one or two options to deal with that. In light of the increased demand, they'll likely try to issue rations, rationing how many iPhones people can buy. And this isn't unprecedented, as during World War II, there were rations on everything from meat to sugar to gas to rubber. And if that doesn't solve the issue, another solution is to implement price controls on the inputs of the items that they originally price controlled. Because if the iPhone costs $1,200 to make, so they're not making it anymore because they can only sell it at $1,000, well then the central planners will go to the materials that are used to make the iPhone. They'll go to the copper, they'll go to the silver, the lithium, the aluminum, the steel, the glass, and they'll say, hey, all of you guys are charging too much. We're gonna institute price controls on all of you because you are inputs to this stuff over here, and we need that supply to continue to increase. So now we're going to limit the price that you can be sold at. I'm gonna make you cheaper so that the iPhones can still be made at a profit to deal with the supply issues that we created. Now, if you can't tell by now, this isn't a solution. This is just a Band-Aid, but it's like a Band-Aid that's made out of razor blades. Because if it's necessary for you to impose price controls on all the inputs that are used for the thing that you originally put a price control on, that means you're going to have the exact same issues here, and you're eventually then going to have to institute price controls on all the inputs for those inputs, resulting in lower quality, higher demand, lower supply, and more shortages. But by now you've recognized this is just a snowball effect. It's a downward spiral. And like I've said a few times already, this isn't far off in the future. These are things that are already starting to be implemented now. And because it's very likely that the current interventions will cause future mispricings in the market, it's also very likely that the solution will be to double down on the failed policy and issue more controls rather than just letting the market work itself out. So be ready, because the things that you see getting more expensive today are the things that they'll issue price controls on tomorrow, resulting in shortages after that. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.